The saw blade bit into the frozen skin of the lake with a sound like tearing fabric, a high, singing shriek that carried for miles across the silent, white world. Elias leaned his weight into the long steel frame, his breath pluming in the crystalline air, each exhalation a ghost of the life within him. Beside him on the ice, the dog, Boro, lifted his great shaggy head, his ears twitching at the alien noise. Boro's eyes, the color of burnt amber, held a deep and patient intelligence. They watched the saw, then Elias, then the vast, indifferent sky, as if weighing the sanity of the entire endeavor. The blade was new, its teeth sharp and hungry. It had cost Elias $1.50 at Olson's Mercantile, a significant portion of his remaining capital. He finished the first cut, a clean, straight line 4 feet long. He moved to his right, measured with a knotted rope, and began the second. The work was slow, a grinding physical meditation. Each push and pull of the saw sent a tremor up his arms and into his shoulders, a dull ache that promised to sharpen into real pain by day's end. This was the first block of 200. 200 blocks, each 4 feet long, 2 feet wide, and 2 feet thick. The numbers were not arbitrary. They were there, sketched in his father's spidery hand, in a journal filled with calculations, diagrams of wind patterns, and observations on the thermal properties of compacted snow. His father had been a man of quiet, peculiar theories, a reader of books about Arctic expeditions and forgotten engineering. Now his father was gone, his mother too, and all that remained were the theories, the dog, and $8. Boro whined softly, a low rumble in his chest, and nudged Elias's leg with his cold nose. The sound of sleigh bells drifted on the wind, faint at first, then growing steadily closer. Elias paused his work, straightening his back with a groan. A horse-drawn sleigh was making its way along the frozen track that served as a road in winter, and at the reins sat Silas Blackwood, their closest neighbor for 20 years. Silas pulled his horse to a halt where the track met the lake's edge, his weathered face a mask of disbelief under his wool cap. "Elias?" Silas's voice was a gravelly thing, scraped raw by decades of winter wind. "What in God's name are you doing, boy?" Elias gestured with the saw toward the scored lines on the ice. "Building a house." Silas squinted, his eyes crinkling at the corners. He looked from the single 4-foot cut in the ice to the small, wind-swept parcel of land 50 yards from the shore, the only thing Mr. Gable hadn't taken. It was a useless plot, rocky and exposed, where nothing would grow. A house? Out of ice? The question hung in the air, thick with ridicule. "It'll work," Elias said, his voice quiet, not argumentative. It was a statement of fact, not a defense. Silas shook his head, a slow, pitying motion. "Son, I know you're grieving. I know Gable did you wrong, turning you out of your father's cabin the moment the ground froze. But this," he gestured vaguely at the lake, "this is madness. That's no shelter. That's a tomb. Wait until winter really gets here, the first real blizzard, the kind that buries fences and freezes cattle in their tracks, will blow that thing apart like a house of cards." Elias offered no reply. He simply picked up the saw and positioned it for the next cut. The conversation was over. There was nothing to say that the work would not say better. Silas watched him for another long moment, his expression shifting from disbelief to a kind of sorrowful resignation. He clucked to his horse, the sleigh runners groaning as they began to move again. "You come to me when you're ready to be sensible," he called over his shoulder. "We'll find you a spot in the barn. No boy should be out here alone." The offer was kind, but Elias knew what it meant. It meant accepting charity, sleeping in the hay, being the town's sad orphan. It meant abandoning the one thing his father had left him that mattered: a plan. He worked until the sun was a pale smear on the horizon, its light failing. By then he had cut the perimeter of 3 blocks. He hadn't managed to free a single one. His hands were raw, the muscles in his back and shoulders screaming. He'd spent another 50 cents on a heavy-duty chisel and a mallet, and he now understood the next stage of the labor would be just as brutal. He sat on the ice, Boro resting his heavy head in his lap, and ate a piece of hard bread from his pocket. The wind was picking up, a low moan that promised colder temperatures to come. He looked at the lines on the ice, the faint beginnings of a wall, and felt not despair, but a quiet, stubborn resolve. This was his home. He just had to build it. The next morning, he returned with a long timber lever and a system of ropes and pulleys he'd fashioned. The cost had been another $2, spent on the rope and a few iron hooks. The work found a new rhythm. After sawing the block on all 4 sides, he would use the chisel and mallet to crack the bottom free. The sound was a deep, resonant thump that shuddered through the ice, followed by the groan of separation. Then came the true test of strength. He would loop the ropes around the massive block, anchor the pulley to a sturdy oak on the shore, and haul. Boro, seeming to understand the mechanics of the task, would brace his own feet and lean into the pull, a low growl of effort in his throat. Slowly, agonizingly, the first block slid from the water. It emerged like a creature from the deep, dripping and clear, a massive slab of frozen time weighing nearly 1,000 pounds. He dragged it across the ice on a makeshift sled, the runners screeching in protest, and up onto the snowy bank of his small property. It took him the entire day, 1 block. He stood before it as dusk fell, his body trembling with exhaustion. It was imperfect, its edges slightly chipped, but it was solid. It was real. He laid a hand on its frigid surface. It felt like a foundation stone. Days bled into a week, then 2. The pile of blocks grew, first 10, then 20, then 50. He worked from the first hint of dawn until the last vestiges of light faded from the sky, stopping only to eat scraps of bread and dried meat or to melt snow for water. His world shrank to the repetitive motions, the shriek of the saw, the crack of the chisel, the strain of the rope, the scrape of ice on snow. He marked the perimeter of his house on the ground, a rectangle 30 feet long and 15 feet wide, and began to lay the first course. The town watched. Mrs. Olson, whose husband ran the mercantile, would sometimes stand at her shop door, wringing her hands in her apron, as she saw his small figure toiling out on the lake. She sent her boy over once with a small pot of stew. Elias accepted it with a quiet nod of thanks, ate it cold, and returned the pot the next day, clean. He bought another spool of rope and a bag of oats for Boro. His total expenditure now stood at $5. Mr. Gable drove past once in his enclosed carriage, the glass windows shielding him from the cold. He slowed his horse, peering out at the low, translucent wall taking shape. A smirk played on his lips. He said something to his driver, who laughed, a harsh, barking sound that the wind carried to Elias's ears. Elias didn't look up. He was fitting a new block into place, using a slurry of snow and lake water as mortar. The moment the wet slurry met the frozen blocks, it froze solid, welding them together into a single seamless piece. The technique was also in the journal. "The cold is not the enemy," his father had written. "It is the tool. It is the nail and the hammer." As the walls grew higher, so did the skepticism. Men would gather at the mercantile, warming their hands by the pot-bellied stove, and talk of the orphan boy's ice palace. "He's lost his mind," one would say. Grief does strange things. It's a danger, another would add. When that thing collapses, he'll be crushed. Silas, to his credit, never mocked. He only watched, his expression troubled. One afternoon, his daughter Clara walked down to the lake. She was younger than Elias, with a quiet manner that matched his own. She carried a tin pail. "Father sent this," she said, her voice soft. "Hot cider." Elias stopped his work. The walls were now shoulder high. He was standing on a small scaffold, wrestling another block into place. He climbed down, his movements stiff. Boro, who barked at strangers, simply trotted to Clara and sniffed her mittened hand before sitting at her feet. "Thank you," Elias said, taking the pail. The metal was wonderfully warm against his frozen fingers. Clara looked at the structure, her head tilted. The sun was low in the sky, and its light passed through the ice walls, making them glow with an internal fire of amber and rose. It was strangely beautiful. "He says it won't stand," she said, not unkindly. "He says the weight will make the bottom blocks shatter." Elias took a sip of the cider. It was spiced with cinnamon and cloves, and the warmth spread through his chest. "He's wrong," he said. He pointed to the base of the wall with his chin. "The pressure makes it stronger. It fuses the crystals. It's called pressure melting and refreezing." Clara looked at him, her eyes wide with a curiosity no one else had shown. "How do you know that?" "My father's books." She stayed for a few more minutes, asking simple questions. How did he get the blocks so uniform? How would he build a roof? He answered in his usual short, declarative sentences, but he found himself saying more to her than he had to anyone else in months. When she left, she turned back at the road. "I think it's beautiful," she called out. Her words were a small, warm stone in the cold pocket of his day. He went back to work with renewed determination. The walls reached a height of 8 feet. Now came the most difficult part, the roof. He spent his last $3 on a few sturdy timbers and some thick canvas tarps from the mercantile. He built a simple wooden frame, a shallow A-frame that rested atop the ice walls. He stretched the canvas over it, securing it tightly. Then, using a ladder he'd fashioned from saplings, he began to cover the entire roof with blocks of sod he had dug up in the late autumn and stored under a pile of leaves. He'd known, even then, that he would need them. He packed them tightly, filling every gap. The final layer was snow, thick and heavy, piled 2 feet deep. From the outside, the roof looked like a natural snowdrift. Inside, the structure was transformed. The world outside disappeared. The howling wind became a distant, muffled whisper. The only light came from the entrance, a low tunnel he had yet to close off, and the translucent walls themselves, which gathered the pale winter light and diffused it into a soft, ethereal glow. It was silent, still, and profoundly peaceful. He built a small hearth and chimney of flat stones and clay against the back wall, a dangerous and delicate process. The journal had precise instructions, a design that funneled the heat inward and drew the smoke up and out through a carefully insulated flue, preventing the stones from melting the ice wall they touched. He moved his few belongings inside: his father's journals, a bedroll, a cast-iron pot, and the remaining food. On the first night, he built a small fire in the hearth. The flames flickered, casting dancing shadows on the glowing walls. Boro lay before the fire, sighing with a contentment he hadn't shown in months. Elias checked the walls near the hearth. They were cool to the touch. The heat radiated into the room, not into the ice. The air, which was well below 0 outside, slowly climbed, to 5 degrees, to 10, to a stable and almost unbelievable 35 degrees. It was not warm, but it was above freezing. It was survival. He sat in the quiet, watching the fire, listening to the muffled wind. The cold was the tool. His father had been right. He had built a house from the winter itself. The skeptics could say what they wanted. He was home. The first test came not as a blizzard, but as a thaw. A freak warm front, what the old-timers called a January thaw, swept through the region. The temperature climbed to 40 degrees. Rain mixed with sleet began to fall. In town, a new round of predictions began. "It'll melt, mister," Gable declared with satisfaction at the post office. "The whole fool thing will just turn into a puddle." Silas worried openly to his wife. "The water will get into the joints. When it refreezes tonight, it'll expand and shatter the walls." Elias watched the rain trickle down the outside of his ice walls, not with fear, but with fascination. The water wasn't melting the blocks, it was simply running off the smooth, hard surfaces. Where it did find purchase in small cracks or seams, it pooled, and as the temperature dropped again that evening, it froze solid, sealing the joints even more securely than his snow-slurry mortar had. The structure dripped and groaned, settling under the shifting weight, but it held. By morning, it was encased in a fresh, clear glaze of new ice, stronger and more solid than before. The rain had not weakened his house. It had fortified it. Life settled into a routine dictated by the cold and the light. Each morning, Elias would emerge from the low, tunnel-like entrance he had built, a design from the journal meant to trap warm air inside, and survey his domain. The world would be blue and silver in the pre-dawn light. He would chop wood, check his snares for rabbits, and haul fresh water from a hole in the lake ice. The afternoons were for reinforcing the walls, adding more snow to the roof, and banking the base of the structure with a deep drift to further insulate it. He was not just surviving, he was living. The physical toll of the construction had hardened him, stripping away any softness, leaving lean muscle and a quiet confidence. Clara visited again, this time with a loaf of freshly baked bread wrapped in cloth. She stepped tentatively into the entrance tunnel and emerged into the main room. Her breath caught. The inside was larger than it appeared, the glowing walls giving it an open, airy feel despite its small footprint. The air was cool but still, free of the biting wind. The small fire crackled in the stone hearth. It felt like a sanctuary. "It's warm," she said, her voice filled with wonder. She unwrapped the bread, and the scent filled the small space. "It's 38 degrees, Elias said, checking a small thermometer his father had owned. "It's 7 below outside." She ran a bare hand over the surface of the wall. It was smooth, cold, and felt unyieldingly solid. "They were all wrong about you," she said softly, not looking at him. "My father, everyone." "They didn't have the book," Elias replied simply. They shared the bread, sitting on a wooden bench he had made. Boro rested his head on Clara's lap, and she stroked his thick fur. They didn't talk much, but the silence was comfortable, a shared space of understanding that was warmer than any fire. Her visits became a quiet ritual. She would bring small gifts, a jar of preserves, a few apples, a mended pair of socks, and he would share the quiet of his strange home with her. He learned about her life in town, her desire to be a teacher, her frustration with the small-mindedness of their neighbors. She learned about his father's journals, his love for the wild, unforgiving landscape, and the deep well of patience that allowed him to build such a place. February arrived, and with it, the deep cold. The temperatures plummeted and stayed there, rarely rising above zero even at midday. The sky took on a hard, metallic sheen. The old-timers looked at it and muttered. Silas stopped by Elias's land, his face etched with worry. He didn't come to mock, but to warn. "There's a storm coming, son," he said, his voice low and serious. He had stopped his sleigh on the road and walked to where Elias was splitting wood. "Not a squall, a real one, the kind my grandfather used to talk about. The sky looks wrong. The animals feel it." Elias paused, his axe resting on the chopping block. He looked at the sky. It was a strange pale gray, and the air was unnaturally still. Boro, who was usually dozing in the sun, was pacing restlessly near the entrance to the ice house, a low whine in his throat. "I've seen it only once before, when I was a boy," Silas continued. "It buried my father's barn to the eaves. We lost half the herd. If this is what I think it is, your little ice house won't stand a chance. The wind on the lake will be like a razor. It will cut it to pieces. Please, Elias, come back with me. Bring the dog. You can't stay here." The concern in the older man's voice was genuine. It was the plea of a man who had seen winter's true face and respected its power. Elias looked from Silas's worried face to the solid, glowing walls of his home. He thought of the 2-foot thick ice, the deeply banked snow, the low profile of the roof. He thought of his father's careful calculations on wind shear and structural integrity. "I have a plan," Elias said. "This is my home. We'll be safe here." Silas shook his head, his shoulders slumping. "Stubborn as your father. God help you, boy." He turned and walked back to his sleigh, a man defeated by a quiet certainty he could not comprehend. Elias spent the rest of the day preparing. He brought in a massive stockpile of firewood, stacking it high against the wall opposite the hearth. He brought in buckets of snow for melting and all his remaining food supplies. He rigged a heavy door of canvas and wood for the entrance tunnel, one that could be sealed from the inside. He checked every seam of the walls, packing any new cracks with fresh, wet snow. Boro never left his side, a silent, anxious shadow. As dusk fell, the world went utterly still. The wind died completely. Not a single needle stirred on the pine trees. An eerie yellowish light filtered through the thick cloud cover. Then, the first snowflake fell. It was not a gentle flake, but a hard, granular pellet, like a grain of sand. Then another, and another. Within minutes the air was thick with them, a horizontal torrent driven by a wind that seemed to rise from nowhere, a low, guttural moan that grew steadily into a deafening, shrieking roar. Elias pulled Boro inside and sealed the entrance. The sudden quiet was jarring. The roar of the storm was instantly reduced to a deep, resonant hum, the vibration of which he could feel through the soles of his boots. The world outside had ceased to exist. He lit a lantern and stoked the fire. The ice walls, which usually glowed with the soft light of the sky, were now completely dark, their outer surfaces already buried in a driving wall of snow. The only light was from his fire and lantern, a small pocket of warmth and life sealed in a tomb of ice, adrift in a sea of white fury. Boro whimpered and pressed against his leg. Elias stroked the dog's head, his own heart beating a steady, calm rhythm. Everything he had done, every hour of back-breaking labor, every moment of doubt and ridicule had led to this. His father's theories were no longer theories. They were the walls around him. He added another log to the fire, the flames leaping high. The temperature inside held steady at 39 degrees. Outside, the storm raged, a monster trying to claw its way in. But the walls were 2 feet thick. The roof was buried and anchored. The cold was not the enemy. He was safe. For 2 days, the world was a howling whiteness. Elias and Boro lived in the timeless twilight of the ice house. He kept the fire small but steady, conserving wood. He melted snow for water, ate sparingly, and read his father's journals by lantern light. The sound of the wind was a constant companion, a deep, vibrating hum that seemed to come from the earth itself. At times, a gust of unimaginable force would slam into the structure, and the entire house would shudder, a fine powder of ice sifting from the ceiling. Boro would startle, a low growl in his chest, but the walls held. They were more than just stacked blocks. They had become a monolithic structure, fused by pressure and cold into a single, solid mass. Elias would lay his hand against the wall and feel the vibration of the storm, a terrifying power, yet he felt no fear. The house was a living thing, groaning and shifting, but it was strong. On the morning of the third day, he awoke to a profound silence. The deep hum of the wind was gone. The stillness was as absolute as the noise had been. He unsealed the entrance and pushed the heavy door open into a wall of solid snow. He had to dig his way out. He tunneled upward, breaking through into a world transformed, remade. The sun was blindingly bright, sparkling on a landscape of impossible white. There were no shapes, no trees, no fences, only smooth rolling dunes of snow that stretched in every direction. The sky was a deep, cloudless blue. The air was so cold it felt sharp in his lungs. His house was almost completely buried, only a small mound and the top of his stone chimney visible. He stood atop the massive drift that had been his roof, and for the first time, he understood the true scale of the storm. The drifts were 15, 20 feet high. The tops of the tallest pines were barely visible. The world he knew was gone, entombed in white. Boro scrambled out after him, blinking in the bright light, his body taut with a strange energy. He barked, a sharp, questioning sound that was swallowed by the immense silence. Elias scanned the horizon for any sign of life. He saw nothing. No smoke from any chimney. No sign of Silas's farm, which should have been visible to the east. There was only the sun, the snow, and a terrifying, beautiful silence. Worry, cold and sharp, pierced his calm. He strapped on the snowshoes he had made from bent saplings and leather straps, another small project from the journals, and began to walk east, Boro bounding ahead of him, plunging into the deep powder. The going was slow and exhausting. The familiar landmarks were gone, and he navigated by the position of the sun and the faint outline of a ridge he knew was beyond Silas's property. After an hour, he saw it. Not a house, but a dark patch on the side of a massive snowdrift. It was the peak of a roof. As he got closer, he saw that the house was buried to the second-story windows. The barn was a long, low mound, its great doors completely obscured. There was no smoke from the chimney. A terrible fear gripped him. He called out Silas's name, his voice sounding thin and small in the vast emptiness. A shutter on a second-floor window creaked open. A face appeared, pale and drawn. It was Clara. Relief washed over him, so potent it made his knees weak. He floundered through the deep snow until he was directly beneath the window. "Elias!" Her voice was a choked cry. "We're trapped. The snow collapsed part of the roof in the back. The stovepipe is blocked. We have no heat. My father, he went to check the barn yesterday before the worst of it hit. He never came back." The words hit him like a physical blow. Silas, out in that storm. Elias looked at the mound that was the barn, 100 yards from the house. There was no sign of a path, no disturbance in the snow. "Are the animals in there?" he asked, his mind racing. "Yes," she whispered. "He was so worried about them." "I'll find him," Elias said. The words were a promise. He left Clara at the window and made his way toward the barn, his mind calculating, planning. The main doors were buried under at least 12 feet of densely packed snow. It would be impossible to dig through. He circled the mound, looking for another way. On the leeward side, the drift was slightly less steep. He remembered a hayloft door, high up under the eaves. It would be their only chance. He spent the next 2 hours digging, not with a shovel, but with one of his snowshoes, scraping and pushing the snow away from the spot where he guessed the loft door would be. Burro dug beside him, whining with effort, his paws flinging snow in every direction. Finally, his snowshoe hit wood. He cleared a larger area, revealing the top of the large wooden door. It was barred from the inside. "Silas!" he yelled, his voice raw. "Silas, can you hear me?" He was met with silence. He put his shoulder to the door and pushed, but it was solid. He took a small hand axe from his belt and began to chop at the thick planks near the latch. The wood was old and brittle from the cold. It splintered and broke. After 10 minutes of frantic work, he had a hole large enough to reach his arm through. He fumbled in the darkness, his fingers searching for the heavy wooden bar. He found it, lifted it, and the door swung inward into the pitch-black cold of the barn. The air inside was frigid and smelled of hay and fear. A low moaning sound came from the stalls below. He lowered himself into the hayloft, his eyes struggling to adjust. "Silas?" A weak voice answered from a corner. "Here." Elias found him huddled under a pile of horse blankets in a small enclosure. His face was gray, his lips blue. He was shivering violently. A half-dozen cows and the 2 sleigh horses were in their stalls below, their breath steaming in the cold. They were alive. "My leg," Silas whispered, his teeth chattering. "I think it's broken. I fell from the ladder when the first big gust hit. Been here ever since." Elias examined the leg. It was swelling badly below the knee. Silas was in the advanced stages of hypothermia. He wouldn't last much longer here. Getting him back to the buried house was impossible. There was only one option. "We're going to my place," Elias said, his voice firm, leaving no room for argument. Getting Silas out of the barn and across the snow was a Herculean task. Elias fashioned a makeshift sledge from the broken loft door and some rope. He and Burro worked together, half pulling, half carrying the older man. Silas was delirious, muttering about the cold. Every step was a struggle against the deep, clinging snow. It took them nearly 3 hours to cover the distance back to the ice house. When they finally arrived, Elias settled Silas inside, piling every blanket he owned on top of him. He stoked the fire until it was roaring, and slowly, painstakingly, spooned hot, sweet tea between the man's blue lips. The warmth in the ice house, which had once seemed so meager, now felt like a life-giving furnace. Color slowly began to return to Silas's face. The shivering subsided. "You saved my life," Silas murmured, his eyes filled with a dazed gratitude. He looked around at the glowing walls, at the steady fire, at the quiet boy who had done the impossible. "This place, it's real." "It'll work," Elias said, echoing the first words he had spoken to him weeks ago. Leaving Silas to recover, Elias went back for Clara and her mother. He led them through the snow, and when he brought them into the warmth and safety of his home, their relief was so profound it was silent. Clara simply looked at him, her eyes shining with tears. Word of the rescue and the shelter somehow traveled. Over the next day, a small stream of survivors made their way to the faint glow of Elias's chimney smoke. The Olsons from the mercantile, their store's roof collapsed. 2 farmhands whose bunkhouse had been blown apart. Even Mr. Gable, his face humbled and frostbitten, arrived with his wife. His grand, multi-story house, with its frozen pipes and broken windows, had become an icebox. He had lost everything. He stood in the center of the ice house he had mocked, his eyes wide with disbelief. 15 people found refuge in Elias's house of ice. They huddled together, sharing what little food they had, their social standings and old grievances erased by the shared, urgent need for warmth. The structure that was meant for one became a sanctuary for a community. They looked at the thick, translucent walls not as a sign of madness, but as a miracle. And they looked at the quiet boy who had built it with a new, profound respect. In the heart of the great storm's wreckage, amidst the ruins of conventional wisdom, the outcast's folly had become their fortress. In the weeks that followed the great blizzard, the ice house served as the town's heart. As the snow slowly melted under the strengthening sun, revealing the widespread devastation, Elias's shelter remained the one place of guaranteed warmth and safety. The community, humbled and united by the disaster, worked together. The men, led by a recovering Silas Blackwood, formed teams to dig out homes and salvage what they could. The women, organized by Mrs. Olson and Clara, managed the communal stores of food and cared for the sick. Mr. Gable, stripped of his arrogance, worked alongside the farmhands he once employed, his silence a testament to his transformation. Elias became an unlikely teacher. Men who had once tapped their heads when he passed now sought his knowledge. They asked about the principles from his father's journals, about the angle of the walls, the composition of the snow mortar, the design of the chimney that drew smoke without melting the ice. He answered their questions with his usual economy of words, but he showed them the diagrams, explaining the logic of thermal mass and the insulating power of trapped air. He was no longer the strange orphan boy. He was the man who understood the winter. That first spring, as the ice house finally began to melt, its walls thinning and weeping in the warm sun, the town held a meeting. They stood on the damp ground where the fortress had been, the water trickling back into the lake. It was Silas who spoke first. "We were fools," he said, his voice carrying in the clear spring air. He looked directly at Elias. "We trusted what we'd always known, and we were wrong. You trusted something new, something learned, and you were right. You saved us. This community owes you a debt we can never fully repay." He turned to the others. "I say we never get caught like this again. I say next winter we build another one, a bigger one, together." A chorus of agreement rose from the small crowd. And so, a tradition was born. The following November, as soon as the lake ice was thick enough, the entire town turned out. Under Elias's quiet direction, they worked as one. The sound of dozens of ice saws sang across the lake. Teams of men and horses hauled the massive blocks. It was no longer a solitary, desperate act of survival, but a joyful, communal act of preparation. They built a great ice hall, twice the size of the original, with thick walls and a soaring timber-framed roof. It served as a community center, a place for gatherings and dances, and a guaranteed sanctuary against the season's fury. Elias and Clara were married the following summer. With the help of his neighbors, Elias built a small, sturdy wooden house on his plot of land, not far from the spot where the ice house stood each winter. It was a proper house, with glass windows and a deep stone foundation, but every year, without fail, he led the construction of the ice hall. It was his gift to the community and their tribute to him. Years passed. The town healed and grew, its character forged by the memory of the great blizzard. The annual building of the ice hall became a festival, a ritual that marked the beginning of winter. Elias taught the young boys how to cut the blocks and the young girls how to mix the mortar. He shared the pages of his father's journals, ensuring the knowledge would not be lost. Boro grew old. His muzzle turned gray, his amber eyes clouded with age. He moved slower, preferring the warm spot by the hearth in the wooden house to the cool air of the ice hall. One quiet autumn evening, with his head resting in Elias's lap, he drew a final, peaceful breath and was still. Elias and Clara buried him on the small hill overlooking the lake, the place where he had watched his master cut the very first block of ice. Elias carved a simple wooden marker for his grave. Boro. He was a good witness. Elias himself grew into a quiet, respected elder. His hands, once calloused from the ice saw, became gnarled with age. His children grew up playing in the glowing halls of the winter shelter, and he taught his grandchildren the old techniques. He saw the world change, saw new technologies and new ideas arrive in their remote valley. But the tradition of the ice hall remained, a bedrock of their community. He gave his father's journals, their pages soft and worn with a century of use, to his eldest son, passing the legacy on. When Elias was 87 years old, he died in his sleep, in the warm wooden house he had built with his own hands. The entire valley mourned him. They buried him on the hill beside his faithful dog, overlooking the lake that had given him his life's purpose. Clara, herself old and frail, chose the words for his gravestone. They were carved into a simple piece of fieldstone. Elias Cole, he built a house from winter. Decades later, long after everyone who remembered the great blizzard was gone, the tradition continued. The building of the ice hall was the most anticipated event of the year. It had evolved, the designs becoming more elaborate, with carved pillars and even windows made from clear, thin sheets of ice. It was a place of light and laughter in the darkest part of the year, a symbol of their resilience, their community, their history. On a cold, clear night in late winter, a young girl and her grandfather stood inside the great hall. The walls glowed from the light of dozens of lanterns, and the sound of music and laughter filled the vast, icy space. "Grandpa," the girl asked, running her small mitten over the impossibly smooth wall. "Is it true? Was the first house really built by just one man and his dog?" The old man, Elias's great-grandson, smiled. He looked around at the magnificent structure, at the faces of his friends and neighbors, all safe, all warm. He put his hand on the wall, feeling the deep, solid cold of it. In the distance, he could almost hear it, the faint, singing shriek of a single saw blade on ice, a sound of stubborn, quiet hope tearing through the silence. "Yes," he said, his voice thick with reverence. "It's true. He built it for $8, and it became all of this."